My uncle was an odd, lonely man. That one guy you try to avoid at family reunions. The one nobody knows too well, but loves to talk about nonetheless. I think he liked me best because I never really enjoyed bad-mouthing him. I wouldn't say we were close, but we tolerated one another. At least, that's how it was when I was little. We never bothered to stay in contact. I forgot about him by the time I left home. That's why the news of his death caught me completely by surprise. Uncle Mac was alone in his apartment when he had a heart attack causing cardiac arrest. He fell unconscious and died within a few minutes. Then there was me at the time. I had just flunked out of college, and the only thing I was actually good at was playing video games. When I was contacted by Mac's lawyer, I was even more shocked. Mac had left me 3 things. A box of sorted letters addressed to me, all the money he used to own, which to me was a lot, and his bar. The one he had inherited from his father and had worked at all his life. I'll be frank, I had no idea what to do with the bar, but I knew from the very start I'd take it over. I felt kind of honored. This had basically been Uncle Mac's entire life, and he was giving it to me, of all people. Sure, from what I knew, there hadn't been many friends or loved ones in his life to choose from, but it was still flattering to me. Once I read the first letter, I was even more convinced. Hi, Julia. If you're reading this, my bad eating habits have probably caught up to me. Or maybe someone killed me, who knows. As of writing this, you're 15 years old. You were the only one to talk to me at the family reunion today. Not for long, but more than just an awkward hello. I notice these things, and I appreciate it. That's why I'm trusting you with the most important task anyone in this family is ever going to offer you. You are going to take over my bar. Besides, knowing you, you're not going to have much of a career anyway, so you might as well. Once you're done reading this, please go to the bar at your earliest convenience. Take the box of letters with you and stash it away somewhere there. It has some valuable advice you're going to need down the line. In fact, you will need to read the second letter right after your arrival. You'll find my employees are a bit special. Anyways, I hope you're doing alright. However this letter finds you. You're a good kid, Leah. Always have been. Besides, the only person you could possibly disappoint by screwing this up is dead, so there's no pressure to impress. Sincerely, your Uncle Mac. I wiped my eyes. They had actually gotten a bit watery while I was reading the letter. I folded the letter and tucked it back into the box before grabbing my coat and bag. Mac's bar was a train ride and a 30-minute walk away from my parents' place, which is where I was residing at that moment. I figured I would probably have to look for a place closer to the bar, if I really would start working there full-time. When I finally arrived at the establishment, it looked almost exactly the way I'd expected. It was just another wall in the row of buildings on the street off to the side from the inner city's market square. A large, bright red double door with a neon sign reading, "The New Saloon," above it. It would probably glow if I'd find how to switch it on. At least, I hoped it would glow. It felt weird unlocking the door and opening it for the first time all on my own. Entering and looking around inside felt even weirder. The New Saloon was your typical old-style dive bar. Even completely empty, it looked overcrowded. The fabric of the cushioned seats was stained and frayed. The walls behind and in front of the counter were plastered with neon beer signs and large framed photos of people I didn't know. Some were even in black and white. The floors were dirty and my heels stuck to them when I walked further in. This place was small, shabby, and smelly, and I loved it. It was so strange, but I suddenly just felt like this bar was mine, and that I needed to take care of it and protect it. Remembering what Mac had told me in the first letter, I pulled out the second one from the box and unfolded it. Hi, Julia. If you're reading this, you're probably at the bar for the very first time. How do you like it? Let me guess. It's ugly and gross, but it instantly started growing on you. Don't worry. It's about to get a lot weirder. You'll find the entrance to the back room behind the counter. The light switch is on the inside of the wall. Make sure to turn it on before you head inside, because there's stairs leading down right behind the door. It's a death trap. Once you're in there, stand in the middle of the room. Stay away from the walls. You may then say out loud the following words. Spirits of this house, by the power of the spell that has bound you, I command you to serve. You'll see what happens next. Whatever happens, keep in mind that you can order them around. When all the work is done, simply tell them to go back into their room. You've got this. Sincerely, your Uncle Mac. I frowned. That was odd. Was this the prelude to some kind of joke? I walked over to the door behind the counter and pressed down the handle. It swung open with a loud creaking noise, and I began to grope around for a light switch. A single light bulb down in the back room came flickering on, and I proceeded down the rickety wooden stairs. No banisters. Risky, especially with the shoes I was wearing. By the time I'd reached the middle of the room, my heart was already beating faster than it should. Still, if this was a prank, Mac had been planning it for over 5 years, and I was not about to ruin it. Besides, no one was watching anyways. I cleared my throat. Spirits of this house, I began, a giggle swinging along in my voice. By the power of the spell that has bound you, I command you to serve. Nothing. Not a single sound for 5 whole seconds. I looked around the room. It was completely empty, except for a single door in the wall across from me. Maybe I'd been supposed to say it in whatever room was behind that one. Just as I was about to walk over to it, a loud noise came from one of the walls to the side. I spun around to find that it had cracked open. Bits of it were beginning to crumble to the floor as the tear widened. I stared at it with my mouth agape, frozen in place and incapable of comprehending what I was seeing there. From the crack, a set of long, bony, pale fingers reached out into the room, gripping the inside of the wall. My throat was too dry to produce a proper scream, but I couldn't contain a gasp as I staggered backwards until my back met with the other wall behind me. It was then that I felt cold palms rubbing against my neck and hands closing around my shoulders from behind. This time I shrieked. I whirled around again only to see that there was a hole there too. Long, skinny arms slowly moving forward from it, grabbing at me, searching for me. I glanced around the room frantically. Holes had opened in basically every spare spot. I counted 4 sets of arms pulling themselves out into the light, followed by similarly slender upper bodies. By the time I finally thought to run back up the stairs and save myself, the people from inside the walls were standing in the back room, fully emerged from their dark hideouts. I didn't risk another look at them. When I finally reached the top stair, I dashed back into the bar and slammed the door shut behind me. I pressed myself up against it just to keep standing. My knees had grown weak beneath me and I was panting heavily, my mind racing. Then I heard them. Slow, light footsteps making their way up the staircase, and stopped on top of it. I heard calm, steady breathing coming from the other side of the door. I tensed up and shifted my weight on my feet, leaning up against it to keep whomever was in there from getting out. I was sure this person would start to try pushing it open, but to my surprise, nothing happened. Instead, a voice rang out from inside.
"Excuse me, who are you exactly?"
It was a man's voice. I had expected something like a growl, or a hiss, or the groans of some decomposing zombie, but this was distinctly more articulate. It sounded almost polite. I didn't know what to do other than respond. "Julia?" I stammered.
"Julia."
The man sounded surprised.
"What about Mac? Wait. If you're here..."
He sounded quite sad now.
"Mac's dead, isn't he?"
"Yes," I replied quietly. His heart stopped.
"That's... Good God."
He fell silent, and I heard him utter a shaky sigh, almost like a sob.
"I'm sorry. Would you give me a moment? I need to tell the others."
"Go ahead," I murmured.
Never mind, they heard us. So, will you let us out now, or?
Who are you? Why were you in there?
We work here, actually. My name is Andric. I do most of the organizing here. I take care of the accounting, our profits, our spendings. I place the orders on most of what we need. Back here with me, I've got Bo, who's our bouncer, and Danica and May, both waitresses.
You work here? I repeated. And you live in the walls? After your shift is over, do you just go down there and melt into the room, or what? I couldn't help but let out a nervous chuckle at the mental image. This was just too absurd. At least I was breathing normally now.
Pretty much, yes.
I shook my head. What are you?
Well, to explain that, you would have to go exactly 122 years back, so it's a long story,
Andric replied.
All you need to know for now is that if you let us out, we'll get the bar up and running right away. We've been working under Mac since he took over this place, though, so you'll have to excuse us if we're a bit gloomy.
No, that's fine, I muttered, slowly turning away from the door and carefully pulling it open. The man in front of me was of normal height, slender, and looked to be in his 30s. Despite being dressed in jeans and a simple black t-shirt with the bar's name printed on it in white swirly letters, he had a very official look to him. Maybe it was the way he stood, straight as a rod with a friendly yet matter-of-fact smile on his face.
Thank you,
he said. Turning back to the room, he raised his voice.
You heard it, everyone. Mac might be gone, and while that's a downer, our work isn't over. So get yourselves up here and let's get this going again.
His tone carried the flat motivation the coach of a youth sports team might have. 3 more people emerged from the back room, all dressed exactly like Andric. All of them that same content little grin on their lips. They walked by me, offering polite greetings. The first one, a large, bulky guy, giving me a curt nod, and the 2 women that followed, smiling brightly. The girls were a little younger than Andric, maybe in their late 20s. Both had blonde hair hanging down their shoulders in wavy pigtails. The first night the bar was open, I merely watched the backroom people work, following them around while they ignored me. It was eerie. They looked almost like automated mannequins, going about their routine by sticking to pre-planned paths. Like there were set directions painted somewhere I couldn't see. I soon began to notice other distinctive attributes about them. None of the people from the walls had fingernails. I saw it on the waitresses when they reached for the cups handed to them, on Andric when he scribbled down notes. However, that was not the only thing off about them. All those little details in their faces, the kind of thing you'd normally never pay attention to, they didn't add up. For example, their eyes didn't line up. One was always slightly lower than the other, just enough for someone to notice. Their nostrils would differ in width, and one of the girl's pinky fingers was the same length as her ring finger. Had I not known that they just crawled out from the back room walls, I would have chalked these harmless little oddities up to simple, inconspicuous deformities. But knowing what I knew, it made my skin crawl with uncomfort. I soon found out that Andric did most of the talking for them. Bo barely ever said a word, and all the waitresses did was whisper amongst themselves, giggle, and chat with the patrons. Eventually, Andric waved me over to him behind the counter.
All right, I'll give you a rundown of the place. We have a cash-only system. We rely on our local clientele, but once in a while someone new comes by, and then we try and keep them around, obviously. Here's some of our regulars.
He pointed at a lady sitting in a corner, weeping over an empty glass of whiskey.
That's Shauna. Comes here whenever she can. Only ever orders whiskey. Will not stop crying.
His finger wandered over to an old, short man with an almost disproportionately large head and short white hair. He was sitting at one of the tables as well, talking to 2 younger women who seemed very much out of place.
That's Tommy. He's likely to start fights, but he drinks a lot and tips very generously. Bo throws him out a lot, but he's very easy on him, so don't worry.
He finally nodded towards a tall glass of wine standing lonely on the counter right in front of us.
And this is Irene. She can't pay, but she's always welcome. She's very nice, and she's been here ever since Mac's family started this business.
Andric, there was nothing there. The pale man threw me a confused glance.
What do you mean, she's right? Oh, of course. Don't worry, you'll start seeing her with time. Either way, for now there's actually not much for you to do, except read up on barkeeping once you get the chance. However, you should start getting acquainted with the regulars. After all, the owner of the new saloon will always be part of the reason why people come here.
He paused as his mouth started to twitch into an almost guileful grin.
I have a feeling they're gonna love you.
I retreated into the ladies' room for a quick break. I sat down in one of the toilets and buried my face in my palms. I had no idea what was going on or what I was supposed to do. Andric had made himself pretty clear when it came to the instructions he'd given me. But all of this was so surreal, I seriously considered the possibility of me having suffered some kind of blow to the head and dreaming it. I spent the rest of the night standing behind the counter and observing their every move. Andric kept to my side mostly, looking at me with the kind of suspicion I probably had in my eyes as well. I couldn't figure him out. I accidentally on purpose walked by the waitresses, who were talking to each other in hushed voices, picking up on small bits of their conversation. Her blood is weaker than his. Do you think she's...
We shouldn't take any chances. Remember what Mac did when we tried to test him? I do, but this could be our chance to have some fun.
Her words sent chills down my spine. Remembering Mac's letter, however, I decided this was not the time to show I was frightened. You're going to do no such thing, I chimed in from behind them. I don't care what you are, but I promise, I'll find a way to make this whole thing very uncomfortable for you guys if you try to pull any kind of weird crap on me. The looks they gave me were worth my initial doubt. They seemed shocked that I had listened in on them at all, let alone spoken up. I glared at them, holding their gaze and ignoring the trembling of my legs. Their heads lowered, they marched off. When the bar began to clear out and we got ready to close down for the night, I told the four of them to clean up. Of course I helped, but I made sure to never lose sight of a single one of them. I felt like they were wild, hungry animals, waiting for their chance to pounce on me. Whenever I looked up from the rag I was wiping the countertop with, I would find one of them staring at me. By the time we were done, the place really did look a lot more welcoming. It certainly was cleaner. Despite the four workers' angry faces spoiling the mood. We carried the cleaning supplies back into the small storage chamber next to the employee restroom, before I went to open the backroom door for them. Okay, everybody, good job today. Thanks a lot, now back inside, I called out, almost enjoying the feeling of authority as they came trotting toward me, and made their way down into the dimly lit basement single file. Andric was the last one to cross the threshold. Right before descending the staircase, he turned to face me once more.
You were keeping a close eye on us, he said quietly. That's clever. But you're gonna need to keep it up, and let's see how long you'll last. Who knows what might happen?
He gave me a sly wink with the one eye that was a little lower on his face before following his coworkers. I watched from the top of the stairs as they leaned up against the walls. It was almost as I had expected. Their bodies seemed to melt into the holes they had come from, sealing them shut and not leaving so much as a thin crack. Lacking a better option, I stayed at a nearby inn that night. As bizarre and frightening as all of this had been, I got out of it unscathed. The bar workers and I would end up coming to blows in the future, though. More than once. And I wouldn't always be that lucky. Not a lot of people visiting my bar are completely normal, well-adjusted individuals. It took me a long time getting on the same wavelength with most of our regulars. But I'll never forget the day I had my first close encounter with one of them. This happened when I was still quite green, as you'll see. His name was Cole. He'd been coming to the bar a lot since we'd opened up again, but Andric said he hadn't seen him around that often before. A few times, yes, but he didn't know anything about him, save for his name. Cole would never talk to anyone. He'd keep his head low and order his drinks in a rough, quiet voice. He stuttered a lot. Once he'd received his beverage of choice, he'd sit down in the emptiest corner of the new saloon, where he would stay for up to 4 hours. I'd watch him from time to time. His head would always be hovering just a few inches above the table, his eyes half closed. I felt sad for him. He looked sort of defeated, although I didn't know by whom or what. The fact that he drank a little more with every visit concerned me. I knew it wasn't really my place to snoop around in my patrons' lives, but I didn't have to be intrusive. All I wanted to know was whether he was okay. So one time, when I handed him his beer, I simply asked. He stared at me for a split second, his eyes wide and watery before he broke down sobbing. He tried to keep it in at first, but eventually buried his face in his palms, tears dripping down his chin. I handed him a napkin before rounding the counter and walking over to him, waving for Andric to take over for a little while. "It's none of my business," I began cautiously. "But if you want to talk..."
"Yes,"
he breathed.
"That might help."
I nodded, and we went back over to his corner booth. Glancing around, I assured myself nobody else was in earshot before sitting down across from him. I didn't have to prod him for him to begin.
"I'm gonna have to kill someone very soon. He's taken everything from me, that bastard. But honestly, I'm scared."
He lowered his voice.
"This thing, it's not..."
"Wait, slow down," I said softly. "What's he taken from you?"
"Simply everything. My house, my job, my wife. It all started when I came home late from work to see the same car I own already parked in my driveway. The exact same one, down to the license plate. I went inside the house, planning to ask my wife about it, but then I heard something. My wife's voice, but also another man's. I could hear them from downstairs in the living room when I came in. I sneaked up to the bedroom, opened the door, and there they were. My wife. And me."
"You?" I repeated, frowning in confusion. Cole shrugged and took a sip of his drink.
"No, not me, of course, but he looked like me. He had the same birthmark on his back. He even sounded like me. I've heard my voice recorded before, so while I didn't realize it right away, his was just like mine. Before you ask, I don't have a twin or anything. The instant I saw him, I knew he wasn't human. He was something else. I didn't know what, but either way, the two of them hadn't noticed me, and once I'd gotten a good look at him, I was too shocked to speak up anymore. Weak reaction, I know, but what was I supposed to do? I went back outside, and after a bit of thinking, I decided to call the police. But when I told them there was someone in my house who looked just like me and that I was scared, they hung up on me. Granted, I probably sounded like I was drunk or high or something, but I was not. You should know that. I've never had any problems with my mental health either. That was just the beginning, though. I'm not a confrontational kind of guy, and I wasn't just going to barge in there. I was afraid, and then, of course, there's the fact he literally managed to trick my wife into... I know I should have done something right away, but I just couldn't. I ended up letting it happen. That and so much more. I slept in my car that night, parked somewhere public since my spot at home was occupied.
Cole let out a dry laugh and emptied his glass.
You must think I'm crazy.
I was staring at him with my mouth agape. I'm not sure what I had expected to hear, but this was not it. This was terrifying. I believed him, though. Knowing where Andric and the others working the bar came from, the concept of doppelgangers didn't really seem groundless. I shook my head. "I believe you," I replied quietly, my voice raw from my parched throat. I was starting to feel like I'd need a drink as well. "Go on." Cole raised an eyebrow in disbelief before taking in a shaky breath.
"When I came into work the next day, he was already there. He was sitting at my desk, reading through the papers stacked up there. I watched him for a little while. I kind of felt like something was draining from me. Maybe my energy or whatever. I'm sorry, I'm not good at storytelling. I suddenly felt incredibly hopeless, is what I'm saying. I waited in the corridor outside my office for someone to come by. I wanted to talk to my coworkers. Surely they'd notice that there were two of me. When the place got more crowded, they did come by, but they all just ignored me. They didn't so much as look at me. Not even when I tried to speak to them. It was like I wasn't even there. And then I realized it. My wife hadn't noticed me either, even though I'd been standing in the doorway right across from her. Nobody I knew was noticing me. When I turned to look back at the other me sitting in my office, he looked right at me. The only one to look me in the eyes in that entire building. And he smiled. Again, I did nothing. I simply went back to my car and drove around, crying like a baby. I remembered the new saloon, and that's how I ended up at your bar again. See, I have nothing else to do anymore. And no one to talk to, either. I don't have any siblings. My parents live overseas, and I don't have any friends who'd stand with me in this. Even if I had, they would have probably forgotten me by now as well. This is the only place for me.
He sighed and raised his glass. It was empty then, but I smiled at the gesture, though sadly. Cole tried to smile back, but his lip was quivering.
It's warmer here than in my car. The drinks are cheap, so I can just forget about everything for a little while. Besides, you guys here don't know me, and since only strangers seem to acknowledge my existence anymore, I'm grateful for at least being alive here. Being a person here, or whatever. This thing pushed me out of my own life. I don't even dare to walk by my own house anymore because of how much it scares me. And I still have access to my bank account, but who knows how long that's going to last.
So now, you want to kill him?
Of course. It's the only way. No clue what he is, but I bought a gun from some shady guy selling weapons underhand, and I'm just going to fire until that thing isn't moving anymore. I've been waiting for too long already. Once he's dead, I'll take over again. I didn't have much of a life, but I was with the woman I love, and I earned enough money to afford some luxury. My life wasn't busy or glamorous or anything, but it was good. And it was mine.
I nodded. I didn't know what to say, so I offered to let him sleep at the bar that night, since it was warm in there at least. Cole shook his head no.
I appreciate it, but I have to start looking for a chance to, it'll be difficult. I need to do it somewhere no one else sees, and I need to keep my wife from finding out. I don't want her to know. Maybe I should tell her, maybe I will someday, but she'd have a complete meltdown, and I just want to keep her safe. I'll be missing out on a lot of sleep from now on, and I won't be showing up here as often anymore, but this has to be my priority now until it's done.
Is there anything else I could help you with?
No. I really don't want to drag anyone else into this mess. Who knows what's going to happen? But for what it's worth, thank you. It was nice having somebody listen to me. And looking me in the eyes, I suppose.
He rose from his seat and handed me the money for his drink directly. I watched as he left, his jacket pulled tight around his shoulders. He gave me a quick glance before he disappeared through the door, the tiniest of smiles on his lips. Good luck, I called after him, catching a few surprised looks from my other patrons. Smiling awkwardly, I got up and walked over to Andric, who was just in the process of drying off a clean glass. He raised his brows quizzically.
It's nice to know you're getting to know your regulars, but you don't always have to take that long. You don't have to play therapist for whoever comes in here,
he told me. I sighed as I joined him behind the counter. I wasn't playing therapist. This guy just really needed someone to listen to him. He's got a bit of a situation. Say, do you know anything about imposters, like doppelgangers? Andric tilted his head.
Well, a doppelganger doesn't always have to be just that. Usually an encounter with one is said to be bad luck, so in a way, they're harbingers of misfortune. However, what you mean is basically an evil twin, and that could be anything.
He rubbed the glass in his hands with a thoughtful look on his face.
Any being able to mimic something or someone can set its sights on you and try to push itself into your life. However, very few succeed. It'd have to be very powerful to deceive its victim's entire social circle. I mean, you'd have to get every detail about them down cold.
And what if it can do that? And it can copy a person's belongings, too, like a car or something.
It'd have to be even more powerful to do that,
Andric replied.
By the way, I'll gladly tell you anything I know, but since your questions are very specific, I'm guessing this has to do with your friend from earlier?
I nodded quietly.
Care to share exactly what he told you?
I'd rather not for now. But can you kill something like what you just described? Like, with a gun? Andric let out a mirthless chuckle.
If you could, life would be much easier for folk like me. But no, most certainly not.
I dropped the cleaning rag I'd absent-mindedly been wiping the counter with and rushed outside, my heels clacking on the wooden floor. I burst through the door, ran past Beau, who flinched upon seeing me dash by, and called out Cole's name, shouting for him to come back. I walked the length of the street trying to find him. I had to warn him somehow. If what Andric said was true, he wouldn't stand a chance. Maybe he could start anew somewhere else instead. It'd be dying at the hands of that shapeshifter. After half an hour, I realized I wasn't going to find him. My head low, I returned to the new saloon. When I came in, Andric was still where I had left him, but he now had an almost sympathetic look on his face. I took position beside him again. "Go do something else, please," I muttered. "I've got this." I just wanted to be alone with my thoughts for a bit. I listened to the sounds of people chattering as I dried off glasses and cups, tidied up behind the counter, and gave out drinks. I didn't know Cole very well, but I'm the type of person who gets invested, I guess. At least, I used to back when this happened. I overheard May whispering something to Danica as they strolled by. "Can't believe Mac left us with someone this weepy." Or at least, it was something to the tune of that. That just added to my mood. For 2 weeks, I waited for Cole to return. I hadn't asked him to, but I was sure he'd come by to let me know he was alright if he were to succeed. I was very busy with the bar and everything, but he was always on my mind, albeit in the back. And then, one day, completely out of the blue, Cole came marching through the door, his arm around the waist of a beautiful, well-dressed woman. My heart took a leap, and I beamed at the two of them, my chest light with relief. "Hi, Cole," I said, barely able to contain the excitement in my voice, but keeping it cool since he had who I assumed to be his wife with him. After all, she wasn't supposed to find out about the whole incident. "Long time no see. What can I get you?"
"Hello,"
he replied, drawing out the word. I could see a hint of confusion in his eyes. "I thought this was your first time here," the lady muttered into his ear. He nodded, but kept smiling politely. I frowned. Why didn't he recognize me? Furthermore, while he could have easily forgotten about what I looked like, why wouldn't he remember the bar? He'd been here time and again during the course of the evil twin ordeal. It took me longer than I cared to admit to put the pieces together in my head. During that time, all I did was stand and stare dumbly as the realization gradually started to set in, and my stomach slowly sank. Suddenly, I felt a warm hand on my shoulder. Turning around, I found Andric standing next to me. He eyed the couple over, but it was obvious he was focused more on the man. Cole was beginning to look rather uncomfortable, almost angry. Eventually, Andric raised his other hand and pointed at a sign behind us on the wall. "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone."
"This is a joke, right?"
Cole asked.
"It's not. Would you please leave now?"
Andric's voice was sharp. I was starting to get nervous. To my surprise, he squeezed my shoulder upon feeling it tremble.
"You know you can't just throw anyone out, right? We didn't do anything. Not you, as in the two of you, but you, as in just you. The lady may stay if she wants to.
What did I do?
Do I smell?
Cole let out an incredulous laugh as he glanced around the bar, almost like he was looking for support among the other patrons. What did you do to him? I pressed out. It wasn't a smart thing to ask outright, but I just had to. Is he alive?
I don't know what you're talking about.
Andrick cleared his throat.
As you can see, your presence is distressing her. Please leave now.
He said this with a deadpan look on his face, his voice flat and steady. Cole's wife looked at us like we were crazy, but I could see an angry gleam in the eyes of the imposter as he turned around and made for the door, mumbling something to the lady about how nuts we were. Wait, I screamed, realizing that this was my last chance to warn her. That man is not your husband. The lady turned around, giving me an odd look, but she didn't stop. Instead, she picked up her pace a little, approaching the exit in a hurry. That's not Cole, I shouted, frantically trying to get the words out as, he's dangerous. I felt Andrick cover my mouth with his hand, pulling me away from the counter and grabbing one of my flailing arms with his other one.
You're gonna get it angry,
he hissed into my ear. I struggled, trying to get over to the woman, but Andrick was stronger than he looked. By the time he let go of me, Cole's wife was gone. I looked around. None of the patrons had gotten up during my screaming fit, like they hadn't even noticed the crazy chick going off at all. Andrick had a bitter smile on his face.
Want to know the kicker? This happens like thrice a year around here.
I still remember a very short letter my uncle left me that kind of relates to what happened back there. It read, Dear Julia, you're nobody's savior. If you try to be, you'll either get yourself hurt or you'll see someone you care about get hurt. Both suck, so keep your distance. Sincerely, your Uncle Mac. My bar is a shabby little thing. Not only does it naturally attract the weirdest patrons, it also never fails to surprise with just how dilapidated it is. One time, I nearly sprained my ankle tripping over a loose floorboard. The back room people and I try to fix the place all the time, but it's like new issues pop up everywhere. We repair a lamp in one of the bathrooms, and next thing you know, another one goes dark. Kind of like that. It wouldn't surprise me if the building was cursed or something. There's upsides to it as well, though. Sometimes we find cool stuff while cleaning. Change, for example. Or in this particular case, a shiny, thin silver necklace with a crystal pendant. Andrick found it while sweeping the floors. May's excited squeals were what alerted me to it. Oh my god, it's so pretty!
Weird. Since when do our patrons have jewelry on them?
Bo chimed in. He rarely says anything, so I remember being surprised at that. Andrick? May began, drawing out the name in a saccharine voice. Can I have it?
Sorry. All items found in the bar are at the disposal of our dear lady.
He handed me the necklace, and I held it up, considering it. Well, someone probably lost it. We'll keep it here and see if they come back for it, I decided. And what if they don't? May inquired, a hopeful look in her eyes. If that happens, then I'm going to start wearing it, I said, smiling as her face fell. I totally would let you have it, but I just don't like people who put up tripwires for me to fall over. May had pulled that actual stunt just a week prior, and I'd almost broken my neck.
And that's why you don't bite the hand that feeds,
Andrick told her in a hushed voice, though I'm sure he fully intended for me to hear. I know it's not good holding grudges, but it was extremely satisfying. The backroom people love playing pranks. I'm used to it, and Andrick isn't as much of a saint as he makes himself out to be. He once emptied an entire bag of potato chips over my head. But May's ones have always been a bit more aggressive. A week went by as we waited for someone to return for the necklace. Then another. I eventually gave in to the desire to declare this sparkly thing my own, and simply put it on one day.
Suits you,
Andrick said curtly, and with that, the matter was off the table. we all just collectively forgot about where it had come from. That was until I came into the bar one morning to find all the chairs and stools had been stacked up in the middle of the room. One large, sturdy pile of furniture that kind of looked like a jungle gym built by someone who hates kids. I already mentioned my employees like to play pranks on me, but when I had ordered them to return to the back room the night prior, the chairs had all been in place. As far as I knew, none of the four could leave until I'd wake them up again, so this couldn't have been one of their practical jokes. I rounded the enormous stack, examining it only to find nothing hinting of its creator. "Andric?" I called out. "Were you guys up yet?" No response. They were still resting, apparently. I stepped up to the door behind the counter, pulled it open, and turned on the lights. "Spirits of this house, get up already." I watched as the four of them crawled out of the wall. Just between us, sometimes I make bets with myself about who will be out first. This time it was Danica. She stretched her arms and waved at me before walking up the stairs, closely followed by the rest of them. "That's new," Danica said when laying eyes on the pile of furniture. "Did you do this?"
Why would we do that? You just make us put everything back,"
Andric replied. I shrugged. He made a good point. It was still fairly unsettling, seeing as if it had not been them, someone else must have gained access to the bar overnight. We tidied up everything, and Andric told me not to worry.
"Weird things happen here all the time," he explained. "Always have. It's probably nothing."
"If you say so." That was only the first of many incidents, though. That same night, the bar was pretty full for once, and we were watching a game on that small flat-screen TV above the counter. I'm not a sports person, but since a lot of the patrons seemed to be paying attention to it, I got sucked in a bit myself. That was until the screen began to flicker and suddenly went out. I could hear disappointed groans coming from several tables, and some guy shouted to make it come back on. Andric shot me a confused look as he reached for the remote. Neither of us knew how odd this was. The TV was the one thing about this bar that had never failed us before. I watched as he pressed a few random buttons, then tried to turn it on and off again, but it didn't react. He groaned and swung himself up on the counter with surprising agility, beginning to fumble around with the back of the TV. I don't know what he did exactly, but eventually it did come back on, transmitting the cheerful sounds of the game.
"There,"
Andric muttered as he climbed back down. I sighed and got ready to clean the counter where he'd stood, when suddenly the loud noise of static cut through the air. I hurriedly glanced up at the TV again, just in time to see a face staring down at me. I couldn't see much of it, just two large gray eyes. The rest was obscured by a thin white bedsheet the person had wrapped around their head and shoulders. Just a second later, the game was back on. I turned around to face the patrons. "Did any of you see that just now?" Some nodded and waved me off like it was no big deal, while others didn't react at all. Andric looked at me with his brows raised. I just shook my head. I decided I would probably have to stop jumping at every small thing happening here. If I'd end up being only nervous all the time, the people here would lose whatever little respect they hopefully had for me. As the days progressed, however, these things kept happening, and it got more and more extreme. I would find the tables turned over when coming in the mornings. One time, 5 of the old bottles we kept behind the counter had been smashed, putting to waste some of our higher quality drinks, and Lord knows we don't have much of those. Our electricity would keep having these little dropouts, and while those never lasted, they would occur often enough to annoy everyone. Worse yet, I kept seeing that face. Every time I turned on the TV, or sometimes even my phone, the image of those large eyes wrapped by that same white blanket would flash up on it for only a split second. Then, one night, Bo came up to me while I was standing behind the counter.
"Hey, we've got someone sneaking around outside, I think."
I looked up at him in surprise. "What do you mean?"
"I keep hearing footsteps, and the trash can behind the wall has fallen over twice now. I picked it up both times. I also saw a person creep around there, a really short one dressed in something white. If you want me to go follow them, I could, but I'd have to leave the door unwatched."
I felt a shiver run down my spine at his words. Please check up on it. I'll keep an eye out for the door while you're gone. Got it. Bo gave me a nod before disappearing outside. I quickly bent down to grab my uncle's box of letters from where I'd stashed it away behind the counter. I had admittedly been a bit lazy with my reading. I had only gone through about 2 more at that point, and neither of them contained any advice on what to do when you'd have stuff like this happening. I hurried to grab and scan a few random letters for information, only to find nothing. Upon realizing that if the bar spirits didn't know what was going on, Uncle Mac probably wouldn't have written about it either, I gave up and instead walked up to the door. I stayed there for a while, but I didn't make for a very good bouncer, especially compared to Bo. A look at my watch told me I'd been waiting for 10 minutes already. I was starting to get concerned. Bo literally should have been back by then. Eventually, I cleared my throat and called out his name in a shaky voice. No response, except a strange noise coming from somewhere to the side of the building. There's a very tight little alley between the bar and the house it borders on to its right. It's a dead end, and it's where the trash can Bo had mentioned was located. I figured maybe he'd gotten stuck there somehow and needed help. It was hard to imagine anything happening to him considering his enormous stature, but it wasn't impossible. I went behind the counter and grabbed one of our large cutting knives, concealing it inside my handbag before waving Andric over and letting him know about what was going on. I told him if I wouldn't be back in 20 minutes, he needed to call the police, but refrained from going outside himself. Thankfully, there were only 3 people inside the bar at the time, and they were all huddled up in one corner focused on a game of cards. At least they wouldn't notice something was up. I walked outside, the cold air hitting me like a splash of water. This didn't feel right. I tried to keep my steps as quiet as possible. Every time one of my heels met with the cobblestones below, I felt myself wince as the hair on my neck stood up. I had already buried my hand in my purse, clutching the handle of the knife. I rounded the corner and looked down the alleyway. What I saw made me freeze. Bo stood at the very end of it, right in front of the wall. He didn't move or speak, but he had visibly tensed up, staring only at the figure kneeling on the ground a little bit ahead of him. There, next to the overthrown trash can, sat a young girl. She was wrapped from head to toe in a large white bedsheet, veiling her in a way that left only her head and bare feet sticking out. She was holding the blanket in place with one hand, while rummaging through the trash that had spilled out from the small container with the other. My eyes remained glued to her for 10 seconds, which felt like an eternity, before Bo suddenly made a surprised noise. I looked up only to find that he had noticed me. His eyes darted between the child on the ground and myself, and he almost seemed to mouth for me to get lost. The girl raised her head. Turning to Bo, she said in a very quiet voice, "Didn't I tell you to stay still?" He immediately froze up again, and she lowered her head, once again focusing on going through the trash. Bo silently raised a finger to his lips. I nodded. She hadn't seen me yet. I didn't know why he was so afraid of her, but I could tell something about her was very wrong. It was not just her blanket, or the fact that she was outside without any shoes on at this time of the year. It was how she felt. When you have a person standing beside you, you can sometimes feel their warmth, and you can see the life in their eyes. It's an odd thing to say, and I can't properly describe it, but you're simply aware of their presence one way or another. This little girl did not feel real. It was like I was looking at something I wasn't supposed to see. It was this alien sense of unease that caused my stomach to churn. Bo slowly took a cautious step toward me, placing the soft soles of his shoes as lightly on the ground as he could. It looked almost like he was trying to cross a river by balancing his way over on an old wobbly bridge. When he finally reached me, he grabbed me by the wrist and began tugging me back towards the bar's entrance. That very second, the girl's head jerked around as she stared at us with wide gray eyes. "Who are you?" she asked, her high-pitched voice shrill and aggressive. She rose to her feet, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders, as she slowly took a step toward us. Before I could answer, her eyes narrowed and she let out an ear-piercing screech. She lunged at me, throwing me to the ground with a strength I would have never expected from her. I screamed with pain as she pushed my head against the stone ground, and for a second or two, everything went black. I could hear Bo growling as he tried to pull her off of me, only to be shoved away. The girl forcefully turned me over, throwing herself onto my back and starting to scratch the back of my neck. "Get off!" I whined. "What are you doing?" Suddenly, I heard a tiny clinking sound and felt something scrape my throat. That's when I remembered the necklace. She had been trying to take it off. Now that she finally had it, she crawled off of me. I groaned, slowly turning around to look up at her. She was sitting on the ground beside me, staring at the shiny necklace in her tiny pale hand. She was incredibly calm all of a sudden. "Thank God. I've been looking for this everywhere," she muttered, talking more to herself than to me or Bo. "If Mom found I'd taken it out to play, if she found out I lost it, she would have been so angry." She slowly raised her head and looked down at me, something akin to a smile on her face. "Mom loves her jewelry. She hates when I touch it." With that, she got up and, necklace in hand, jogged over to the end of the alley. She was heading right towards the wall, and just as she should have been about to run into it, she disappeared. She didn't fade out or anything, but one second she was there, and the next she was gone. I stared after her with my neck craned for a good 2 seconds, before starting my first fruitless attempt to get up. My whole body was aching, and I let out a small whimper. Bo rushed to my side and shoved his arm beneath my shoulders to pull me up, but he was rough, and my sides flared up with pain. He apologized and ran back inside the bar, returning with Andric at his side. I chuckled as I looked up at the both of them, tears of pain in my eyes, yet at the same time weirdly amused by the sheer absurdity of the situation.
"What happened?"
Andric asked softly, leaning down to help me get to my feet. "Ask Bo later," I muttered, whining as he propped me up.
"Didn't you have a necklace on you?"
"Wasn't mine. Gave it back." The two of them half led, half carried me inside the new saloon. I contemplated going to the hospital, but then again, nothing was broken, and as far as I could tell, it was just bruises. We closed down early for the night, and I sat down in one of the cozier corner booths. I didn't get up until morning. I really did end up spending the night in my shabby little bar, my head resting on a table the back room people had thankfully cleaned for me. It was nice having them all be polite at the same time for once. I didn't sleep the entire night, though. I asked Danica to bring me a pen and paper, and then told them they could go into the back room and rest if they wanted to. To my surprise, some of them stuck around, though. Bo went straight downstairs, while May stuck around to watch TV. I had brought a couple books with me, and Danica had borrowed one on small business, which she was reading a lot more diligently than I ever had. Andric had sat down on the cushioned bench with me, and was watching me ponder over my pen and paper.
"What do you want to write?"
"Since none of you knew about the little girl with the blanket, I've been thinking the letters Uncle Mac left me might need some additions." Andric laughed.
"You haven't even finished reading them."
"True. But I hope whoever gets the bar after me will be more up to the task. And hey, since you're here already, you should help me out. You knew about doppelgangers, so what do you think about this?" So now there's a letter from me somewhere in that box among those that Uncle Mac left me. I won't transcribe it exactly, since I just wrote down the better part of everything I know above, but here's what I added with Andric's help. It's possible she's a poltergeist. However, she apparently isn't bound to any person in particular, and has no trouble showing herself in the same form for an extended period of time. Poltergeists are said to be more likely to haunt a person than a location, which we're not sure is the case with her. She seems to have detailed memories of a past life, mentioning her mother as the reason why she was after the necklace. We don't know exactly how that got into the bar, by the way, but in the end we're just glad to be rid of it. So if you find any piece of jewelry in the bar that looks like it doesn't belong, just stash it away somewhere the girl can easily find it. Please don't make it hard on her. She seems really confused. It wouldn't be the last time we'd meet her, though. You might remember some of the regulars of my bar, the new saloon. This is actually about the crying lady who always orders whiskey here. Shauna. For a long time, I didn't know anything else about her. Since I'm not retelling these stories in chronological order, I should probably mention that this happened before the incident with the little girl. It was not long after the whole coal ordeal, though. What you need to know is that sometimes I have these little sudden spurts of excitement and curiosity. One day, I experienced exactly that, and the object of my interest was the sobbing lady in the corner. I stood around watching her for a while, unsure of whether I should go over there or not. I wanted to talk to her, but I was worried it would upset her. I asked Andrick what he thought, and he said just to try. So that's what I did. I walked over to her, another glass of whiskey in hand. "Excuse me, Shauna?" "Hi." She looked up at me, her long, flowing gray hair framing a wrinkled, puffed face. "Hello. Are you Julia, right?" "I am," I replied, placing the glass in front of her. "On the house. Can I sit with you?" "Yes, sure," she whispered, her voice shaky and stifled with tears. I smiled and sat down across from her. Up close, her eyes looked even sadder. I cleared my throat. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but why are you crying?" Shauna stared at me for a few seconds before lowering her head again, giving way to more heavy sobs. Her shoulders were shaking, and there was spittle running from her slack lower lip. "Little Brendan. It started with little Brendan. He was the first one. The first one I cried for. That was so long ago. So long ago. Over a century, maybe even 2. I winced. I hadn't expected her to start talking this freely, much less about something that happened 2 centuries ago. Part of me wondered if she was simply confused or a little crazy. But at that point, the experience a certain patron had had with his doppelganger was still fresh in my mind. So who was to say this was impossible? "I'm from a hill. From a mound," she went on, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I ascended from it. I need to warn them. I need to warn everybody. But I need to mourn them, too. I've given up on the warnings. It happens everywhere, but I can't be everywhere, so they'll never hear my screams. So I have to cry for those that have been forgotten. The ones that disappeared or were replaced. The babies and the poor souls whose lives were stolen." "What do you mean?" I asked quietly. I wanted to understand. I wished to know more so desperately, yet none of what she said made any sense to me. "My dear lady," she uttered in a soft voice, looking up at me through hooded eyes. "You don't look like Mac at all. You're so different from him. It's strange he chose for you to take over." I frowned. "How so?" "Because..." She looked like she'd forgotten what she was about to say. "I don't..." Her voice broke up again, and she lost herself in a fit of sobs. Suddenly, she sat up straight. Her head jerked up, and she looked me right in the eyes. I almost jumped at the unexpected movement. When she spoke up again, her voice was very stern and flat. "Little Brendan was out playing with his friends when they ventured into a forest nearby. They were not supposed to go there, and they knew, but they were children. They were careless. What they were unaware of was the beast that stalked those woods. The beast their parents had not warned them of, believing themselves progressive in their rejection of this local superstition. They figured it was a forest full of wild animals, nothing else. Dangerous, yet to be expected. The children began a game of hide-and-seek, and all were found except for one. No one ever saw Brandon again. They found a torn piece of clothing strung up somewhere in a tree. It was the only thing left of him." Shauna paused, tilting her head like she was wondering if I'd been listening. "When Brendan died, I wept for the first time. I sat by the creek where his mother and sister would go fetch water, and there I wept, waiting for them to come and see me. They knew he was dead even before the other children returned with the news of his disappearance." I sat staring at her, my head reeling. She was still staring at me, but her shoulders had slumped again. She slowly reached for her glass and brought it up to her lips, taking a small sip of whiskey before continuing. Every one of my sisters has a family to warn or weep for. They follow them through the ages. They bring them news of a loved one's death or impending doom, even if the person in question is far, far away. I don't have a family like that. I'm here for the rest of them. My mind was spinning. Part of me was terrified, but the other part was simply overwhelmed. It was too much information to process. Suddenly, I felt a hand on my shoulder and looked up to see Andric standing above me.
I'm sorry, Shauna. I need to borrow her for a second.
With that, he helped me to my feet and led me through the bar's double door, out into the chilly, dark night.
It looked like you really needed a break and some explaining, maybe. She's intense, huh?
You could say that, I muttered, reaching up to rub my temples. So, you know more about her? Is she dangerous or anything? Andric smiled and shook his head.
Not in the least. She's not human, though.
We really don't have a lot of those coming in, do we?
We don't have a lot of them working here, either,
he replied with a shrug.
Shauna isn't like us, though. Actually, I pity her a little. Shauna is a banshee, or at least something of the sort. Legends and fairy tales aren't reliable. Someone always gets something wrong.
He paused.
Do you know anything about banshees?
I sighed. Of course not.
Well, banshees are a type of spirit. The name means something to the tune of women from the fairy mound, though they can hardly be called fairies. They're more like something in between, I'd say. Anyways, they are harbingers of death or extreme misfortune. Sometimes they'll even predict deaths. When you see a banshee, one that isn't Shauna, and she's crying or wailing, it means that either someone you're very close to has died or maybe about to.
Wait, she said something like that. Something about how her kind has to follow a family or something.
Some banshees have been said to be tied to one family in particular. That's true. Others appear randomly. Shauna, on the other hand, she has an entire group to tend to. Namely, everyone whose deaths are related to something unnatural. As in, she won't mourn someone who dies of old age, for example. But she has to cry for everyone who's gotten killed by, say, an evil spirit. He sighed, looking up at the sky almost dreamily. Imagine that. Chances are she'll never be able to stop crying. She can probably hardly keep up.
So, she'll just be sad forever? That sucks. Can we do anything to help her? Andric shook his head, no.
It's what she is. You can't stop her from being what she's supposed to be. You wouldn't be able to drag me away from this bar, either. It's not exactly the same thing, but sort of. She won't stop, ever. That's why she sits around here all day. She's given up on running around trying to find people she's crying for. So she just cries to herself, I guess. I think she's trying to live a normal life. I don't know where she lives or where she gets the money to pay for her drinks from, but I never talked to her long enough to find out.
I hung my head. I felt sorry for her. She'd seemed rather nice, too. Suddenly, I had an idea. If she knew about the deaths she was mourning, then maybe she'd know about Cole. I rushed back inside and plopped down on the cushioned bench across from Shauna again. Hey, I have this friend who I think might have had something really bad happen to him. There was this thing, this creature that could make itself look just like him, and it took his place. He said he wanted to go up against it. I haven't seen him ever since, and I know the monster is still living his life, so... You want to know if he survived? She said quietly. I nodded, and the old woman let out a wheezing sob. I'm sorry for asking, I quickly added. I didn't mean to bother you. I just thought... I remember him. It's been a while, but I remember. Her voice was weak and faltering, as though she had to push herself, pressing out each word with laborious difficulty. I screamed when I saw his doom was impending, but then I stopped. I knew he was in great danger, but I don't know for sure he died. My chest suddenly felt lighter than ever. I suppose I had forgotten just how much Cole's disappearance had been weighing down on me. I wondered if he truly had survived, and if he would ever come back and tell me what exactly had happened. But for the time being, I was satisfied knowing there was at least a chance he could have made it through. It was all I could ask for, and more than I'd expected. Shauna, thank you so much for telling me. I hope I didn't bother you. I had to know what happened to him. It's all right, she breathed. To my surprise, she reached for my hand, giving me the faintest of smiles. I took it and squeezed it. Her skin was wrinkly and her fingers stiff, but there was a comforting warmth to her touch. And then, all of a sudden, she opened her mouth and began to scream. Her voice, now shrill and loud, cut through the stale air and put an abrupt end to the tranquil chatter of the other patrons. The old woman's other hand had jerked across the table, her bony fingers wrapping themselves around my wrist with a strength I would have never expected her to possess. She yanked me towards her by my arm, pulling me onto the table, still shrieking like a wild animal. I was in shock at first. I couldn't move at all. Then I managed to crane my neck and look up at her. Her wrinkled face was contorted into an odd, twisted expression I couldn't read. Her eyes had rolled back into her head, and spittle was dripping from her open mouth.
It's coming. It's coming for you. It'll eat you alive. It'll find its way in and tear you apart from the inside,
she roared, her voice deep and mighty. I couldn't help myself. I began to scream, begging her to let go of me. Her grip on my arm was relentless and sent tears of pain into my eyes. She's going to break my wrist, I thought.
It'll spread inside you. It's coming now.
Shauna's cries drowned out even my own voice. The words left her lips fast. Some of her spittle flew into my face, hitting my cheeks as I tried helplessly to recoil.
The spirits will bind you. He'll try to. He'll try.
Her voice trailed off, and she began to gasp for air. Andric had come up to us and kept pulling on her arm, trying to separate her from me. Finally, she let go of me, and I sank down onto the table. All this had happened in a matter of seconds, but it felt like she had held me in place for eternity. My arm was burning with pain, and I was panting like crazy. Danica came running up to me first.
Oh my God, are you okay?
The blonde girl asked, carefully picking me up by the shoulders and placing me back in my seat.
I think something's broken,
I whimpered.
What the hell was that?
Andric was towering over Shauna, looking down at her in both anger and disbelief. She wasn't responding, though. She just sat still, her lips quivering as though she was still weeping. But not a single sound left her lips. Eventually, she slowly pushed herself up from her seat. Andric, looking puzzled, stood to the side to allow her to walk past him. I watched her leave, her crooked, frail figure disappearing behind the red double doors.
Are you just gonna let her go?
Danica asked Andric, still looking aghast.
Yeah, let's go catch the ghost. That'll work out well,
he replied, shaking his head.
This has never happened before. She's usually really passive. I don't know what's gotten into her.
Glancing down at me, he added,
Does it hurt a lot? How bad is it?
I literally can't move my hand, I told him, biting my lip to keep myself from crying. Not only was there this searing pain in my arm, but I was also pretty shaken up. Shauna's words were still echoing in my mind. If she could predict people's deaths and warn them of it, what did that mean for me? I sincerely hoped she just had a confused fit, as cruel as that sounds, but I didn't actually believe it. No, to be honest, I was terrified.
You should see a doctor,
Andric said.
Any idea on how to get to a hospital?
He was right. I wasn't going to drive using just one hand. I ended up going outside to make a few phone calls. I thankfully got a friend of mine who lived just around the corner to pick me up and drive me. I don't remember the details, but my wrist wasn't broken. It still took a little while for me to be able to move it again. Plus, my arm was severely bruised, especially where she dug her fingertips into my flesh. In the end, the worst thing about it was the shock, I suppose. Shauna wouldn't come back around for a long time afterwards. She stayed away from the new saloon for like 5 months straight, if memory serves me right. When she came back, it was like the whole thing never happened. We were wary of letting her back in at first, but when we eventually did, she just sat down again and cried. Shauna and I never really spoke at length again. I'll be honest, it felt really strange writing all of this out. Not just because it's been so long and I still feel sorry for the burden Shauna has to carry, but also because I know now what she told me about that day really had been a warning. And now, years later, I also know what she'd been warning me about. This thing that was coming for me. It. I can feel it inside me even as I'm typing this. I like my bar. It's gross and dirty, and everything here is always broken. But I loved it the second I came inside. The employees are a handful, but you learn not to let that bother you. They just enjoy playing pranks. And I'm one step ahead of those most of the time anyway. Take Andric, for example. Andric's thing used to be to pour stuff over me. I've had potato chips, confetti, sugar. He wanted to give flour a try too, but when I saw him weirdly perched on the counter with something hidden behind his back, I could see it coming from a mile away. I just walked right up to him and said, "If you do that, I'll have you clean it out. I'll lean over the sink and you're gonna wash it out." I was actually serious. Andric lowered his head and slowly slid off the counter. Considering that, a lot of things here aren't exactly as bad as they seem. There was still plenty Uncle Mac had seen fit to warn me about, though. What I'm about to tell you happened very early on. I think it might have even been before I met Cole. I wasn't used to anything yet. Rather, I was still trying to wrap my head around all the strangeness that had so suddenly been thrust upon me. I was standing behind the counter on a slow day, reading one of my uncle's letters. Dear Julia, about the backroom people. You've probably noticed by now that they're not as bad as they seem at first glance. Their pranks included. I bet you've gotten a couple of tripwires already. I've had to go through the exact same thing. But it's okay. They need you as much as you need them. But it's important you do not make them dislike you. You can anger them, sure. Punish them for jokes that go too far. But don't be cruel. You're probably not the type for that. But I'm still saying it just to be safe. You don't want to know how they can get when you give them a reason to hate you. In case you do want to know, though, you'll find the whole story in the letter after this one. Or maybe you can just ask Andric about it. Perhaps he likes you enough to let you in on it more carefully. I don't know. Just consider it a fair warning. Sincerely, your Uncle Mac. I looked up from the letter in confusion. I figured I really should ask Andric first, but upon turning around, I found myself face to face with him. I let out a tiny gasp, and he took a step back and apologized. Did you see the letter? I asked. He nodded, so I asked what it was about. He took the piece of paper from my hand and scanned it hurriedly before giving it back to me.
I don't want to talk about that. You're still adjusting and you just end up being afraid. You've got a job to do. Just try getting used to that first, before digging into something you might not like finding out about.
Come on. This place has spooked me plenty of times already. I can handle it. Andric shook his head.
Please, just be patient. There's being able to handle something, and there's being able to handle it well. Two different things. Easy to confuse.
I gave in, but of course I read the letter that night, when he and the others were asleep in the back room. I know I might have been better off heeding his advice, but there's some things you just can't push into the back of your mind and ignore. This was one of those. There was also the intrigue of Uncle Mac's secret life. Reading his letters always gave me this uncanny yet familiar feeling. I had known this man, but not really. While he was alive, I hadn't thought him to be interesting in the least. But now, it's a very strange thing to think about. I sat down in one of the corner booths with the letter. The bar was silent and empty. The only light that was still on was the tiny tabletop lamp in front of me, illuminating the pages in my hands. The image of Uncle Mac the way I'd known him, a tall, heavy yet visibly strong man, with stubble on his chin and unkempt brown hair, was still fresh in my mind when I began to read. Dear Julia, my father wasn't a good man. His name was Steve. Nobody who knew Steve liked him. He had a superficial kind of charm, but once you spent more time around him, the true colors started to show. It was his job to run the bar, and while he was popular with the regulars, that slimy asshole treated the employees like shit. For your information, Leah, the backroom people don't need much. If they ever want anything, they'll be very direct about it, and you should grant them what little they ask of you. But there's no need to pamper them. They're made for doing what they do. This place is their life. You're probably wondering what they are exactly. They've been called a lot of names throughout history and different cultures, but none of those descriptions really capture the essence of our four spirits. My grandmother called them domovoi. My grandfather insisted they were brownies. But in essence, they're fairies of the hearth. Domestic spirits. Creatures that at one point have been attached, or attach themselves to, a house or a family and seek to establish order there. They're helpful, mischievous at times, and spiteful when angry. But most of the time, they're quite alright. As for Andric and the others, they're a little different from the old tales. For one, a house spirit's presence is more often felt than seen, but these guys just strut around the bar like they own the place. They're not very shy. Also, instead of just sowing dissension or whatever when they're provoked, they've gotten violent before. My dad always used to take me to the bar with him, even when I was little. He said he wanted me to get used to everything, but I think he just wanted me to be an extra hand. He was the kind of guy who cleaned glasses with a spit, you know? Back when I was little, the backroom people were very nice to me. They'd try to take on most chores that were given to me so I'd have more time to play. My father, however, wasn't as popular with them, and for good reason. He'd chase them around, scream at them, call them names, and even threw a glass at one of the girls one time after closing. I have to be honest, he frightened me when he'd get like that. Worse yet, I could see the backroom people growing increasingly discontent with him. But they appeared to be less afraid than furious. I would often ask my father why he wasn't being nicer to them. I simply didn't get it. They were perfectly friendly. They never did anything wrong. Dad just laughed and said, "They're not human, boy. They're more like devils than people, and someone has to put the fear of God into them." That settled the matter for him. I saw it was getting worse, though. These hateful glances the backroom people would shoot him, how they'd whisper to each other when he wasn't listening. I had a feeling something very bad was about to happen. And soon. You can only hit a dog with a stick for so long until it starts biting you. It was Andric that bit. I saw him go down to the back room in broad daylight one day. Nobody had told him to go down there. I was confused, obviously, so I followed him. I stayed at the top of the staircase and watched as he knelt down in the middle of the room, his back turned to me. He was sitting up straight, his head lowered almost abjectly. He was mumbling something, but I could only pick up on snippets of what he was saying. It was something along the lines of, "Have mercy on my soul and forgive my disrespect," but I wasn't quite certain. It was an unnerving sight. Andric had always been this calm, lively guy, but right then he looked almost menacing. I was nervous, so I shifted my weight on my feet, causing the floorboards below me to creak. I winced, and Andric's head jerked around. I backed away, but he'd already seen me. He hurriedly stood up and quickly climbed the stairs. He grabbed me by the wrist and pulled me back inside, shutting the door behind us. I stared up at him with wide eyes, nervous and uncertain. I didn't know what I'd just overheard, but I had a feeling it wasn't good. "Hey, buddy," Andric said, crouching down to get on eye level with me. The softness of his voice took me by surprise. I had expected him to be mad at me, but he didn't seem to be. Not at all.
"So, can you keep a secret?"
Don't get me wrong. I knew this wasn't right, but I didn't want to risk testing him, so I said yes.
Then I'd really like for you to not tell anybody you saw me pray.
He tilted his head.
I'll know if you tattle on me.
I won't, I promised, my heart sinking. Curiosity overtook me, though. I stammered. What were you praying for?
Forgiveness.
Did you do something bad? He smiled bitterly and shook his head.
No, but there's something bad I'm going to have to do soon. It's necessary.
He paused and looked over at me with a sad expression, like he felt sorry for me.
Can you do something else for me? When you're home tonight, please go to bed early and don't get up.
I would have done anything just to end that conversation, so I quickly nodded and told him I would. Andric patted my shoulder and walked past me. I tried hard to sleep that night, but despite my efforts, I laid awake. My talk with Andric had really shaken me up. I wasn't sure what he was going to do, but I was afraid nonetheless. My mother and father had already gone off to bed a long time ago and were peacefully asleep, just like my baby brother and sister in the room next to mine. I kept glancing over at my alarm clock, which is how I knew that it was around 3 a.m. when I heard a strange noise coming from somewhere downstairs. It was a kind of metallic clattering. I got up from bed and quietly opened the door that led out into the hallway. I tried to make as little noise as possible as I sneaked down the stairs and around the corner. It was coming from the kitchen, I was sure of it. To get into our kitchen, you'd have to walk through the living room first. So that's what I did. I crouched down and crawled over to behind the couch where I decided to stay and hide. I figured who or whatever was rummaging around back there wouldn't spot me. But since the kitchen was open and not separated from the living room, I could still look inside from where I was hiding if I just leaned over a little. I carefully peered out from behind the couch, just in time to see the oven door swinging open. What happened next shouldn't have been possible. Our oven was of normal size, able to fit a turkey but not a person. And yet, from behind the door, 2 hands emerged, grabbing on to each side. They were followed by a head, then a neck and shoulders. A loud creaking noise accompanied the intruder, as he slowly pulled himself out of the oven and onto the tiled floor. More and more of him came slithering out of that confined, dark space, not unlike an enormous snake emerging from its lair. It was grotesque. The way his limbs bent and stretched as he crawled outside. No human body could ever move that way. I clung to the edge of the couch cushion, trying to keep my hands from trembling and my heart from beating too fast, for fear the man would somehow impossibly hear it. Finally, he rose to his feet. I watched as he looked around in the kitchen in the darkness. There was a block of knives on the counter, and he grabbed one by the handle and pulled it out. It was slim and sharp. He held it up as though he was considering it. My stomach turned. The man let out a soft sigh, and, knife in hand, made his way out into the living room. He walked by me without even stopping, and my heart leapt with relief. However, when the moonlight coming in through one of the living room windows fell onto his face, I found it to be strikingly familiar. Don't get me wrong. I had known all along it was Andric, but there was a difference between knowing something and realizing it. He made his way upstairs, his feet not making a single sound as he carried himself across the floor. I waited until I was sure he'd reached the hallway above before I crept out of my hiding spot and followed him with bated breath. When I arrived on the upper floor, I found that the door to my parents' bedroom stood open. I hid behind the door frame and cautiously peered inside. My mind was racing with thoughts of what he was going to do. Would he kill my father? Stab him or slit his throat? I wanted to do something, stop him somehow, but I couldn't. I knew if I were to try and fight him, it'd be my death sentence. I was sure of it. In hindsight, maybe if I just screamed loudly to wake my parents, Andric would have fled, but as a little boy, that simply didn't occur to me. My breathing had become faster and more labored, and I covered my mouth and nose with my hand, trying to quiet it. From where I was cowering, I could see my mom and dad sleeping in their bed. Andric was sitting on the floor to my father's side. He had turned on the small lamp on his nightstand, the light of which was just dim enough to not wake either of my parents. I watched as he peeled away the blanket and pulled out my father's arm. He then brought the blade of the knife to his mouth and, to my surprise, slowly dragged his tongue across it. I could see his spit glistening on the tip. He was holding Dad's arm in place with his other hand and, mumbling something I couldn't quite understand, lowered the wet knife down onto Steve's exposed palm. I knew he'd cut him because the knife came back slightly bloodied. Andric carefully set the weapon aside and pressed Dad's palm into a tight fist with both hands. He was still whispering to himself until he eventually withdrew, picked up the knife, and got to his feet. Realizing he was coming back, I quickly slid behind a nearby cabinet, hoping he wouldn't see me. He didn't. Andric calmly walked back outside, shut the door behind himself, and went back downstairs, only stopping on his way to straighten a framed photo hanging on the wall. I heard water running down in the kitchen, and assumed he was cleaning the knife, followed by the sound of the oven door being opened and shut. When I was certain he was gone, I went back to bed. I spent the rest of the night lying awake, too terrified to sleep. My father had changed that night. Everyone in and outside of our family noticed. He had completely lost his temper. He didn't yell or shout anymore, but neither did he smile or laugh. When he wasn't working at the bar, he just sat around at home, staring into the distance like a zombie. He ate and slept and all that, but it was though the rest of him had completely vanished. He rarely talked, and when he did, it was mostly just nonsensical rambling and eerily soft voice. I was still very young at the time. Seeing my old man like that frightened me, and I avoided him like the plague. I never told Mom about what really happened that night. She sought out the help of doctors for both the body and the mind, never giving up hope that her husband would return to her the way he used to be someday. I was the only one who knew that no earthly medicine could ever cure my father of what had befallen him. I was the only one who knew of Andric's curse. Steve died early, when he was in his late 50s. I took over the bar, and that was that. At first, I was wary of Andric, but I wasn't about to make the same mistake as my dad. I was always nice to him and the others, and eventually they started viewing me as a point of trust, even a friend. That, Julia, is the type of relationship you want to have with the backroom people. Be their friend, but a friend with authority. A good boss, basically. There's no need to be afraid of them. And when there is, well, you'll be the first to know. Now, I know you well enough, kid. You're mellow. Unlikely to lash out. But still, I didn't sit down and write out this childhood experience like it was a horror story for nothing. So please do take it to heart. I don't want to scare you, it's simply a warning. Sincerely, your Uncle Mac. That was how I found out more about the backroom people. Of course, it was hardly all there was to know about them, but it was a start. Mac's letter had left me with a queasy feeling of dread in the pit of my stomach that day. As much as I hated to admit it, Andric had probably been correct. I really should have waited a bit longer. Better yet, when I kept to myself the following day, he immediately knew what was up. He caught me on my way out of the bathroom.
You found out about Steve, didn't you?
He began. I nodded slowly.
Okay, listen. I'm not planning on doing anything to hurt you. I mean, not right now, I'm not. If you start acting out on us, I might change my mind. Steve simply had to go. I did not sign up for being kicked around.
I raised my brows. Then what did you sign up for exactly?
Never mind.
No, tell me. Uncle Mac said something about you being bound to a place. You mean you agreed to that? Is that what happened? Andric threw back his head in exhaustion and let out an exasperated groan.
Just go back to work.
I didn't prod. At least not that day. Even I knew it was too early. You might have guessed it already, but I've had my bar for a long time. And by now, I actually consider myself a pretty alright owner. I've gotten to know all of the regulars. I learned how to mix a couple good drinks. And I even made up one of my own. Although that didn't work out very well. Especially for those poor souls who pitied me enough to give it a try. I'm so sorry, Danica. My point is, after I had properly adjusted to the bar's needs, and those of my employees, a lot of things came much easier to me. I started working harder as well. I saw to it that the bar got as clean as possible, which still wasn't all that clean, but it's the thought that counts. And I even hung up a couple new pictures and signs here and there. That's not to say I suddenly became a pro or something, mind you. There were still things I didn't find out until later. For example, there was one letter left by my uncle that was a little more thoroughly sealed in its envelope than most of the others. Mac had scribbled something on its back. Don't read this until you've seen the real Irene. That obviously got me thinking. And not only because it rhymed a little. I mentioned Irene before. The lady who allegedly was in the bar on my very first night, too. Andric poured her a glass of wine back then, and told me that, for some reason, she would always be welcome here. The weirdest thing about that was that I couldn't see the woman that he was talking about. At first I thought she wasn't there at all, thinking Andric was pulling my leg. But that was before I found the letter Mac had told me not to read yet. After that, I made a few attempts to question the bar's spirits about it, but it didn't get me anywhere. That was until one late summer night. It had been a particularly pleasant day at the bar, and one of the rare occasions on which we got a couple new patrons. It was a group of guys bar hopping, and we'd apparently not been the first establishment on their route, since they came in singing and laughing. They were extremely upbeat and asked May, Danica, and me to sit with them for a few minutes. There weren't many other patrons in at the time, so I figured there'd be no harm in joining them for a bit. I won't lie, it was fun talking to them, despite them being buzzed, at least until Andric came over with an uncomfortable look on his face.
Hey, could you stop being so loud? Irene doesn't like the noise.
Well, tell Irene to leave then, May replied, shooting him an angry glance before returning to the beaming man she'd been chatting to. It's a bar, things get lively. Andric sighed.
Julia, would you please?
I think Julia's just as involved in this conversation as we are. She's with us on this. May cut him off. Which I'm only mentioning because of how rare it is for her to show me any form of companionship. I was almost sad to turn her down. Sorry guys, but I think if it's bothering Irene, we should keep it down. About time to hop on over to the next bar for you anyways, isn't it? The boys got on their way, and May stared at me like she wanted to murder me. But I didn't want to risk disrespecting the invisible entity that was said to be sitting at the counter with a glass of wine. Andric seemed content, and I followed him behind the counter to talk. So, what did Irene say?
Just that she'd like some peace and quiet for the night. She was very apologetic about even asking.
He sighed.
I kind of hate that May doesn't care about her,
he added in a lower voice.
She's being really insensitive.
Why are we whispering? I answered in a similarly quiet tone.
Well, I don't want her to hear,
he uttered, glancing over at the wine glass on the counter with a quick smile. He then leaned in and whispered into my ear.
I don't want her to be upset. She had it rough, you know? You gotta be careful with dead people who've suffered a tragic loss of life. They can be very fragile. And when they experience intense emotions, they get destructive.
So you're worried she's gonna run rampant in here or something? Wait, that would make her a ghost, right?
Oh, she's a ghost, all right. And yes, but I feel sorry for her too. I'm not sure you're ready to hear about what happened to her.
His voice trailed off, and he glanced down at me uncertainly. No, I'm ready. Tell me. Andric looked a tad apprehensive, but eventually shrugged and shook his head, as though he was trying to chase the thought away.
Yeah, well, not right in front of her. After work.
I spent the rest of the night staring at that lonely wine glass. It was an eerie sight up there all by itself on the countertop. Once we'd cleaned up after closing, I announced to 3/4 of the back room people that they'd be having some extra time to chill upstairs. At least that decision was met with mild approval. Bo and May sat down in the back so they could watch TV without craning their necks, and Danica started reading one of my books again. Andric and I, however, made our way into the back room. In my first post, I mentioned that there's another door down in the basement where the employees sleep. I haven't written about it since, because there simply hasn't been any reason to. When Andric led me over to it that night, though, I wondered how in the world I'd been able to forget about it up to that point.
Alright, so what you should know is that there's a reason that door stays shut, he began. There's something behind it, and it has to do with how Irene died.
I felt a chill run down my spine. What is it? I muttered. Is it trying to get out or something? Andric stifled a chuckle.
No. It's probably nothing like you imagine. It's not a living, breathing thing. It's more of a scene.
I don't get it, I confessed.
I know, it's complicated.
Andric paused to rub his forehead and thought.
I might not be the right person to tell you this, but why not? Your family didn't just end up with 4 household spirits and a bar that attracts freaks. I mean, our dear, dear regulars, simply by accident. There was planning involved. Lots of studying certain lost arts, and a lot of difficult decision-making, for better or worse. What I'm trying to say is that your ancestors were pretty deep into some dark stuff. The kind that messes with your head and drives you to do some very bad things.
Like what? He sighed and slowly reached out for the door handle.
Like murder.
He pulled and the door swung open, wide. It was accompanied by an eerily loud and drawn-out creaking noise reminiscent of some sort of crying animal. And to my surprise, the dim light coming in from the larger room illuminated the small chamber rather well. The first thing I was greeted by, however, was a waft of stale air, mixed with various odd fragrances ranging from flowery to sickly sweet. Then I saw it. The image in front of me didn't even register with me at first. When it did, the room around me seemed to spin for a few seconds. I felt bile rising in my throat. My footing lost, I staggered and almost fell on my back, but Andric quickly grabbed me by the arms to steady me. I won't pretend I'm some kind of fearless badass, but I don't consider myself squeamish, especially after some of the things I've seen. Yet, whenever I think of that little chamber in the back room, my stomach turns almost exactly like it did when I first saw it. Inside the tiny room, propped up against the wall like some sort of bizarre life-size doll abandoned by a careless child, sat a body. It was almost completely naked except for a large, thin blanket that had been wrapped around it. Its arms and legs, if indeed it had any, were obscured by that same blanket it was cocooned in, so that only its shoulders, neck, and head stood out. Its skin was brown and looked like strained leather. Its face held no eyes. There were merely 2 empty sockets staring back at me, and its mouth was opened unnaturally wide, twisted into a silent scream. There were bits of hair clinging to its shriveled scalp, though I couldn't tell if they were fake or not. They resembled long white yarn rather than actual human hair. The rest of the small space was filled with jars and jugs, so many that they had to be stacked atop one another in places. Some were made of glass, allowing me to see their contents. Mostly dark powders of sorts, but also various liquids I didn't recognize, but assumed to be oils. I stared at the wrapped-up corpse in horror, too terrified to move or even speak up. I would have liked to ask Andric to shut the damn door again, but I simply couldn't move my lips. The longer I looked at it, the more details I noticed. such as the 4 burnt-down candle stumps in one of the glass jars, and the weird symbols that seemed to be both sewn and painted on the mummy's blanket. Eventually, Andric let go of my shoulders, weary of whether I was going to stumble again or not, and reached out to shut the door. Thankfully, my legs remained firm beneath me this time. I suddenly had to gasp for air, realizing I'd been holding my breath for a few seconds. The image of that twisted, disfigured body was still fresh in my mind, but I already felt a little better just because the thing itself wasn't right in front of me anymore.
"Are you okay?"
Andric asked. It took me a moment before I was able to reply to him. "What was that?" I breathed.
"Sadly, that was Irene. Or rather, what's left of her."
He gave me a regretful look.
"Let's get you back upstairs."
Back in the actual bar, I sat down on one of the bar stools and placed my reeling head on the countertop. After a while, I got up to drink some water, which finally made me feel a little more refreshed. One of the bar spirits had opened the windows so I'd have some fresh air, and I gratefully sucked it inside me. Once I had recovered, I told the 4 of them to go to sleep. I myself wasn't quite ready to go home, though. Instead, I took out the letter that read, "Don't read this until you've seen the real Irene," and carefully freed it from its envelope. I had expected a long story again, but the writing was rather brief. "Dear Julia, if you're reading this, that means you've seen the little chamber and what's inside. I told you not to read this until then, so you wouldn't go looking for it. I saw it way too early in my life, and it gave me nightmares. I didn't want the same thing to happen to you. But now I suppose the damage is already done. And so I bet you're wondering why she's down there. The answer to that is about as unclear as it is dissatisfying. We're not sure. By that I mean neither I nor the bar spirits know the exact answer. What we do know is that Irene was once, a very long time ago, a member of our family. An early ancestor, so to speak. Sometime before the bar came to be, and even before we acquired the 4 hearth sprites, she was chosen to be killed as a human sacrifice. Her body was embalmed, but as you might have guessed, other ways to preserve it were used. Unnatural ways. Saying it was magic that mummified her feels silly, but you get my point. When I first stumbled across her, I asked my dad about her. He couldn't tell me any more than what I just told you, though. He said he assumed her body had been stashed away inside the bar ever since the building had been erected. It's all very strange to me, and I guess to all of us. But at least now you know. As for why she was killed, I have a theory. As you know, the new saloon oftentimes attracts strange creatures, strange people, or people in strange situations. Maybe Irene is the reason why. Maybe the remains of a person killed and preserved by unearthly means, and for an unearthly purpose, act like a beacon, or an invitation to things unknown. It's just a thought of mine, but perhaps that's why they're all here. The letter wasn't signed. I remember thinking Uncle Mac must have been so lost in contemplation when he wrote this letter that he forgot. On my way home that night, I felt dreadful. Neither the contents of the letter nor the small chamber left my mind, nor would they anytime soon. One more thing changed that night, however. From then on, every time Andric poured a glass of wine, I could see who it was for. An older lady in a weirdly fashioned dress sitting on one of the bar stools. Her head hung and eyes downcast. Irene wasn't there every day, but she came by quite often. For the longest time, I avoided the gaze of those eyes. I didn't want to think about her. Neither her fate nor the remains down behind the back room. Then one day, she spoke to me. But I won't be writing about that just yet. My bar is no stranger to weird happenings. But the one I'm planning on telling you about today might have been the one to leave the strongest impression on me. Well, maybe not the strongest, but it's definitely in my top 3. As you can probably imagine, that's saying quite a lot. As for when this happened, I'm not quite sure. But I know that I was on a friendlier basis with the bar spirits back then already, so it couldn't have been too early. The day in question began very pleasantly. There was a good amount of people coming in to grab drinks, but not enough for it to be stressful. Everyone was in a reasonably good mood. Even May wasn't giving me any snark that day. Now, with everything being this nice and easy, it felt like the day simply had to be shaping up to something bad. You just can't have that much good luck all at once. Not with an establishment like this. So let's just say I was weary. Though I wasn't sure what to be wary of. After cleaning, we all sat down to watch some TV, which we do quite often after closing up, by the way. The bar spirits aren't always on board. Sometimes they only want to get up, work, and then go back downstairs right after. But occasionally they do like spending time simply hanging out. I'm pretty sure Mac used to encourage them to relax as well, and I really want them to have as much free time as they used to have when he was still around. Maybe even a little extra. I've always wanted them to loosen up. The four of them had pulled a bunch of our cushioned chairs into a spot where they could easily see the screen from, and I was lying sprawled out on the bench behind them. As uneventful as the day had been, it had left me feeling exhausted. I was only half awake as I decided to take a small nap, but from where I was lying, I could still see the counter and of course my employees. And through my tired, hooded eyes, I saw a bottle on one of the upper shelves move. I squinted, too lazy to raise my head and almost certain I'd imagined it. The shelf I was watching was holding some of our more expensive drinks. We'd normally lock them away at night, but we hadn't done so yet. There were just 5 of those bottles, and Andric had neatly placed them at the exact same distance from one another to really bring out how good they looked. So, the middle one, the one that had been shifted, now stood out. The longer I thought about it, the more I wondered whether I was actually just seeing things. It took all my strength to keep my eyes open just a little longer, but I managed to monitor the shelf long enough to see another bottle move. This time on the one on the far left. Puzzled, I pushed myself up. Hey, did you guys see any of that just now? Saw what? Danica asked, swiftly glancing back at me over her shoulder. I groaned and raked through my hair with my fingers. There's something wrong behind the counter, I think. Those bottles up there, they moved on their own. I quickly wiped a bit of drool from the corner of my mouth.
Is there any chance you were dreaming?
Andric asked, not looking away from the TV. No. And I'm sure you don't mind that our fancy bottles you love dusting off so much aren't standing exactly 6 inches apart from each other anymore.
It's 7 inches.
Andric slowly rose from his seat, a confused frown on his face.
You're right. That's not.
His voice trailed off. He made his way behind the counter and was just about to reach for the shelf when suddenly he stumbled. It was almost like he'd been pushed by some sort of unseen force. I swear I could see his belly bend a tiny bit, like someone had rammed their arm into him. Andric gasped, but quickly caught his footing. He stared at the spot he'd been standing in utter bewilderment, then looked over at us again.
Don't move,
he mouthed. I froze in place, my back pressed up against the wall. Eyes flitting over to the others, I found that Beau and the 2 girls were sitting just as still as me. I shot Andric a questioning look, but he appeared to be focused on something else. He seemed to be scanning the small space around him, before slowly backing off towards the door to the back room. He pressed himself up against it, still looking alert. He gave us a quick nod and a wave of his hand, like he was motioning for us to come over to him. One by one, we hesitantly got up and made our way behind the counter. Not losing a single word, Andric opened the door for us and we hurriedly slipped inside. He followed right behind us and pulled the door shut. Until he finally found the light switch, we all stood huddled up on top of the staircase in the pitch black. When the light came flickering on, I let out a sigh of relief. Beau spoke up first, his voice barely more than a low whisper.
What's going on? Julia, you were right. There's something there. Or someone. I'm not sure. I can't believe it got past me. I swear I would have noticed it normally.
He sighed.
Oh God, I'll never watch TV again.
What's out there? I asked him.
That's the thing. I don't know. I can't see it for some reason, but I sensed it when it was moving around there next to me. And when it punched me, of course.
I turned to Bo. Can't you go out there and take care of it? He usually handles all matters of security. Andrick answered in his place.
It's not good going up against something you can't see. It's either using some kind of cloak or spell, or, what would be even worse, it's strong enough to disappear without any help. Both ways it'd be best to wait for a good opportunity instead of simply running out there.
Then what do? We can't just stay in here. I don't want it messing up the place, I hissed. I think he was trying to get our attention, that's it, Danica told us in a low voice. We can't seriously let it think it spooked us. She was right. I was literally hiding with a bunch of ghosts from what was probably another ghost. Maybe it was time we established some dominance. We're going back out, I ordered, squeezing over to the door, but Andrick turned to stand in front of it, blocking me from reaching the handle.
You're forgetting that it punched me. It could be violent. You don't want it smashing one of those bottles over your head, do you? I'm just glad I already put the knives away.
I'm not going to spend the night in here with you guys either, I replied in that same hushed tone as I gently nudged his arm aside and closed my fingers around the door handle. I cautiously pressed it down and opened the door just a crack, leaning forward to peek outside. I could only see a small portion of the space behind it, but everything seemed to be quiet. I couldn't see anything moving either, so I took a nervous step forward, the door swinging open. I gestured for the spirits to follow. Standing back in the open room, we all glanced around in uncertainty. Everything looked perfectly normal. I let out a soft sigh and wiped my sweat-laced palms on my pants. I was obviously still unnerved, but at least it appeared whatever had happened could possibly be over. At least nothing was attacking us out of the blue. You think it's still here?
It feels like it's gone.
Andrick looked over at the other bar spirits. They all either shrugged or nodded their approval. I swallowed. Okay, well, maybe that was it. Maybe this is like with that little girl and the necklace. Something came by, gave us a scare, and left. And you guys were distracted. Things slipped past you. That's all right. Shit happens.
So what do you want us to do now?
Bo asked. I thought for a few seconds before telling them to lock up anything that could be thrown over or broken, just in case. I'd also prefer if one of you could stay up and keep watch around here tonight, I added. Andrick volunteered, and I promised I'd let him go to sleep as soon as he wanted the day after. But he didn't even care. I think the fact that something unwelcome had gotten into the bar without him noticing really hurt his pride. When I was sure everything was taken care of, I got on my way to my car, which I had parked in a nearby spot, a short walk away from the bar. That night, those few steps felt like an eternity, though. Everything was so quiet. I could hear some noises in the distance, but they were too far away to give me that feeling of reassurance I desperately needed. My chest was light with relief when I finally reached my beat-up sedan and climbed inside. On my way home, I listened to the radio, in an attempt to ease my mind. I couldn't tell why I was still anxious. Everything was all right. The bar was safe under Andrick's watch, and if something were to happen again, he'd be able to call upon the other three. I was sure they'd be doing just fine. And yet, something felt off. At the time, I wasn't living at my parents' place anymore. Not long after inheriting the bar, I had moved to a cheap yet relatively spacious apartment, which I had grown rather fond of. The only downside was that it wasn't as close to the bar as I'd hoped it would be. But everything close to the town center was just ridiculously overpriced. Once I'd arrived back home, I hurriedly peeled off my clothes and hopped into bed. I figured all I had to do was sleep off the night's excitement and everything would be better in the morning. I was certainly motivated to do so. I dozed off the second my head hit the pillow. I woke up to a loud, shrill noise, like glass or porcelain shattering. I sat up instantly, dazed and confused but alert. Everything was silent. Then there was a low, crunching noise. It was coming from somewhere in the living room. My heart sank. There was someone there with me. Trying to combat my groggy state, I rubbed my eyes and pinched my arm, hoping the tiny, painful sting would clear my mind. A look at my alarm clock told me it was 4 in the morning. If there really was an intruder, I had to call the police. Where had I left my phone again? I cursed inwardly as I remembered setting it up to charge on the kitchen counter. To get there, I'd have to go through the living room, which was obviously out of the question. I decided I had to get outside right away. I slowly and quietly slid out of bed, placing both feet on the cold, smooth floor. With bated breath, I padded over to the bedroom door, nudging it open and slipping out into the hallway. All the lights were off. For some reason, the darkness gave my surroundings an eerie sense of unfamiliarity. Boxes, lamps, and cabinets were nothing but shadowy silhouettes standing in my way. This might sound silly, but I felt like a stranger in my own home. I sneaked past the doorway leading off to the side into the living room, and headed straight for the front door. I don't know how I'd expect it to be open, but it was not. And when I reached for the handle, I found it to be locked. I frantically began searching around for the keys in the darkness, still desperately trying to stay quiet. They were gone. Nowhere to be found. Whoever had gotten in had taken them. My mind raced. What else was there to do? I could hardly climb out through the windows. I was way too high up. If I was to hide away in one of the other rooms, the intruder would find me sooner or later. There were keys to lock all these doors inside the apartment with, but, and I'm ashamed to admit this, I had no idea where they were. I finally decided to barricade myself in the bedroom. My heart pounding in my chest, I made my way back down the hallway. I could hear rattling coming from the living room again. Curiosity overtook me, and I stopped outside the doorway, slowly leaning over to peer inside. My stomach dropped. There was no one there. The room was void of any people whatsoever, and yet all of my drawers and shelves had been rifled through. The papers, magazines, and books they'd been holding lying scattered on the floor. The cupboard where I'd stored all my dishes stood wide open, and I watched in a mix of horror and disbelief as one by one, bowls, plates, and glasses alike were swiped from their spots and thrown down onto the floor, with such force that they shattered into dozens of pieces. It hit me like a ton of bricks. Whatever had been inside the bar earlier had followed me home. It was then that the noise stopped. Everything fell still. I backed off, shrinking behind the doorframe again. I didn't dare take a single breath. All of a sudden, I was knocked from my feet, a body I couldn't see bashing into me and throwing me to the ground. My head bounced off the carpeted floor. It didn't hurt as much as I'd thought it would, but before I could so much as finish that thought, I felt something pressed down on my throat. It was almost like someone had placed their lower arm over it and was now slowly shifting their weight onto it, choking me. I struggled beneath them, trying to shake them off, but the person, or whatever it was, remained firmly in place. I felt my head begin to spin, panicking as the need to breathe grew stronger. My whole chest felt like it was burning up, the pain accompanied by a sharp, agonizing pull somewhere inside my throat. My vision began to falter, sudden sparks of light bursting in front of my inner eye as I stared up at the ceiling lamp, unable to turn my head. I was gurgling and whimpering, trying to beg this invisible thing for mercy, pleading for it to let go. I was already too exhausted to keep struggling, and now attempting to focus what was left of my energy on sucking in what little air I could still draw into my body. Then, suddenly, the weight was lifted from my throat. I gasped for air, taking in deep, heavy breaths, relieved even though I could still feel that large, unseen body on top of me. When my chest was finally rising and falling steadily again, I craned my neck, trying to at least face this creature. "Please," I pressed out. "What do you want?" I felt something touch the side of my face. Its sensation almost akin to that of skin, but way colder and more rough. A raspy, guttural voice responded. It sounded like nothing I'd ever heard before. It was deep, warped, and interrupted by the wheezing breaths of its owner, which weren't unlike those of my own from just a minute prior.
I apologize for the delay. Norman sends his regards.
With that, the body lying on top of me disappeared. The person didn't stand up or anything. They were simply there 1 second and gone the next. I was left alone, lying on the carpet in my hallway, still staring up at the dark ceiling. To say I was too shaken to move would be an understatement. It was rather as though the shock of what had just happened had drained me of all my strength. I suppose I felt overwhelmed. When I gathered the energy to stand up and walk again, I went to check the mess in the living room. I found my apartment keys right there in the cabinet, in the same place that had formerly been occupied by a stack of plates. Nothing was missing. My phone, my wallet, my credit card, it was all there. I didn't doubt the invisible entity had been looking for something before they descended into pointless rage, but they apparently hadn't found it. I didn't call the police. I knew immediately that this was something personal, and it would turn out I'd have to deal with it for a long time to come. You've just heard part 1 of My Uncle Left Me a Shifty Little Bar in His Will. Part 2 is going to be on the channel next Monday. This story was written by a girl from the crypt. I'll be linking her Reddit profile in the description below. I hope you all will check out the author and support her work. Thanks for listening. Become a channel member today for early access, bonus videos, and special emojis only available to members. Check out the description below or click the join button for more info. If you'd like another way to help support the channel, please consider joining my Patreon page at patreon.com/Jordan Group Horror. As a patron, you'll get access to bonus videos and content. You'll be credited at the end of every video going forward, and if you decide to stay for 3 months, I'll name a character after you which will be featured in a Hollow's End story, just like these fine folks. Many have already been featured in a story taking place in the strange and supernatural town of Hollow's End. If you haven't watched it yet, check out the Hollow's End playlist on my channel. I'm really proud of it, and I think it's some of the best stuff I've written so far. My favorite part has been coming up with characters for members and using their suggestions as a jumping off point. Links to join the Patreon are in the description. Thanks everyone for listening. Please like, subscribe, and comment to help the channel continue to grow. And see you again next time at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Hope you have a great night.